Today's guest is Evelyn Lee. She's the head of workplace strategy and innovation at Slack. She's also the founder of Practice of Architecture, which I'm really looking forward to learning more about. And then Evelyn is also the co-host of the Practice Disrupted podcast, which I just listened to the latest episode. It was fantastic. I really encourage. I'll put the link in the podcast here so everybody can access it. So thanks for joining me today, Evelyn.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeremy. I always appreciate being on somebody else's podcast and not having to direct the conversation, not being the driver.
So for those who have not had a chance to meet you, talk about your background. Where are you from, who you are, and what you do.
Um, I'm a licensed building architect. I feel like when I talk about technology and architecture, I have to prefix that by building, because there's a lot of software architects in the world. I'm a licensed building architect who, through many different twists and turns of my career, found myself in the tech world. I'm not on the product side, though. I kind of make that very clear. I'm on the employee experience side. So, any any software company out there is at its core a business. So you definitely need people driving and creating the product, doing sales and marketing, but you also need people supporting and being advocates for employees. You need people ops or HR people. We have a whole biz tech solution group just to support the hardware and software of our employees, let alone the product. So I feel like people often forget that there's a whole just general G&A business function to running a company.
Definitely, right? Facilities and you're right, accessibility, and there's there's absolutely tons of things that you have to deal with. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about how that works for somebody for a company like Slack, right? Let's back up a little bit though. Did you always know you wanted to be an architect?
I did. I knew at a very young age. It usually pins on a fourth grade um, assignment from my elementary school teacher, where everyone she asked everyone to draw their dream home, and most people tend at that age, I feel like, tend to draw what we call elevation, right? Your standard stick home with windows and doors, and I immediately started drawing for whatever reason in plan, right? So I felt like there was a little bit of a differentiator there, but I had never met an architect in my life. I didn't know what it was really that architects did, but I knew that this is what I wanted to do. And that remained true until I became a licensed architect. And then I was just like, I don't know if this is the right profession for me. So that was a very long journey to licensure. But yes, I mean, in the beginning, I always knew I wanted to be an architect.
So knowing that, then I'm assuming you picked a school based on the educational quality you wanted for architecture.
Um, my So yeah, so there's so many. There's a little over 100, I think. NAB, National Architecture Accreditation Board. There's a National Architecture Accreditation Board, and there's a American Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. But you essentially want an accredited school, which speeds your path to getting licensed at the end. But I did a 5-year undergraduate degree at Drury University, now Drury in Springfield, Missouri, and I ended up there because there's very few schools that allow you to play soccer and do architecture at the same time. So I ended up in Springfield, Missouri, and then I did a 1-year what they call post-professional degree at SCIARC, which is the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles, and that's how I ended up in California, and I've stayed here ever since.
Now, licensure is per state, or is there a national?
Yeah, so it's regulated at the individual state. There is what's called NCARB, the National Council of Architecture Registration Boards. Some states adopt NCARB law or NCARB bylaws. So any changes that NCARB makes, it automatically rolls into the state. Other states, because it is a regulated certification, it's harder to get things changed at the state level. So there are some different variances from state to state. California and a handful of other states actually happen to be one of the few states that allow you to forego a formal education for experience, for example. So yeah.
Oh, that is unique. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Especially in the state with the most earthquakes.
Yeah, they also have an extra test at the end. So it's licensure is based on three things. It's education, experience, and testing. And then California is one of the few states also with an extra test. So yeah.
Oh, interesting. So then after you graduated with your education, did you go into architecture?
I did, and I practiced, and so that was the education part, right? The getting the degree.
Right.
You have to have so many seated hours doing certain things. That's the experience part. So many hours on like actually on the construction site, so many hours putting together construction documents. That's the experience part. So I was in I was in two different firms over like 7 years, and earning the experience part, and then taking the test to get licensed. So I did Home Depot sited apps, which I can tell you whether or not there's a mirrored floor plan just by looking at a Home Depot from the outside, depending on what side the lumberyard is on. Like that will forever be seared into my brain. And then I worked for a firm that did a lot of K through 12. So in California, a lot of modernizations of K through 12 schools, and then community centers.
So what then brought you to a technology company?
It's a long and twisty and windy road. So the interesting thing with architecture is, and one of the reasons why I went and worked at the firm that was doing schools was I thought I would get to engage a lot with the end users. You find out very quickly that even if you work with schools, your end user or your client is really the school board or the school district, not so much students and teachers necessarily. And in the state of California, they have this system where they award projects to the lowest bid on the contractor side. Often that means on one of my projects in particular, the contractors, there's definitely, I don't want to pigeonhole contractors, there's definitely good, well-intentioned contractors out there, but this contractor set up a separate module, like a separate trailer where they were essentially looking for mistakes in our drawing so they can change order their way to a profit because they won based on a lower bid. And I was like, this is like a really ridiculous system to get schools built that are educating the future. And I realized, there were systems in place and policies that I would never be able to affect or change. And I ultimately wanted to be in a place where I was talking to the stakeholders that were engaging in the building. And I was never a good designer from a aesthetic standpoint. I love designing systems, which I feel like building architects do a lot of too. But that was never my core strength. So I left architecture and I went and I worked for a nonprofit organization. At the time, it was called Public Architecture. I ran this program where we asked architects to give 1% of their billable hours towards the public good pro bono. And it was interesting because at the time, it was just before the Great Recession, and architects were doing really well at this time. We had a whole bunch of architecture firms signing up, and they were having the worst problem trying to find pro bono projects to like literally give away their services to. And a lot of it was just a lack of education of what architects do. So, right, a lot of nonprofit organizations don't understand that. And most people only go to an architect if they need like a ground up brand new building, or if they need like some type of renovation. But I had to educate them on, like, if we just rearrange your space, you could operate more efficiently, or, if we make some minor changes, we might set you up to get the appearance of those changes for potential funders or donators might take you a little bit more seriously, and then you could kind of increase the pot of money that you can then go out and do social good for. But I also realized we are horrible at business and architecture, and we lack any business skills. So I went back to school, and in those conversations with the nonprofit organizations, I couldn't speak their language to the value set that they were looking for. So I went back to school, got my MBA, tagged on an MPA, which is public administration, because why not? I think part of the PA also stemmed from the fact that there was all of these larger organizational systems that were driving how architecture is created, and inevitably the built environment touches some type of government legislation. So I think in the back of my mind, that's partially why I pursued the PA as well. And then I came out and I started working for an architecture firm. This is probably all very dry to
No, this is
listeners,
fascinating, actually.
Okay. So I started working for an architecture firm in the strategy group. And the strategy group was really interesting because I think architecture firms tend to offer a very specific set of services. And the strategy group asked the question, well, how do we become trusted advisors to our clients? So we were particularly looking at how do we expand services on both the front end and the back end of our projects to be that trusted advisor for clients, and to make sure that they call us even before they know whether or not they need a new building. So a lot of that work, oddly enough, I did a lot of work with NGOs and universities and for-profit and nonprofit clients. But a handful of that work was actually what I would call workplace strategy. So how do we grow our business in place without growing our real estate footprint? And a lot of that was all pre-pandemic, like moving from an all office situation to hoteling, and having that conversation there, and then creating new ways of working. I remember in one instance, I was brought in on a project because another architect had come in and created all of these gorgeous office, all of these collaboration spaces that nobody was using. And they couldn't figure out why anyone was using them. It was this older insurance company. And if you just started talking to the employees, it's like, well, if I'm away from my desk, then I'm not perceived as productive. So why would I go use a collaboration space? So we came in and we did the change management of that. We shifted the cultural mindset about like what it means to be productive, and really kind of set up new ways of working, even pre-pandemic in organizations. And that's kind of the long and short of it, is because you only have an hour-long podcast, or is that that's essentially what I'm doing now in-house at Slack as we emerge from the pandemic and figure out like how are we working going forward.
No, that's very interesting to me. Now, would you also, from an architectural perspective, there are many incentives for companies to refactor things to be more efficient from say a power air perspective, right? The state will be very grateful, right, and provide tax benefits if they do that. Is that something as well that you have to tackle?
I think that absolutely plays into it as well. I think there's an oddly weird dynamic going into San Francisco, and don't somebody's going to like listen to this and go look it up. So don't absolutely quote me on it, but I feel there's this dynamic where companies are taxed, or they are what they pay into the city is based on their show up rate. So the mayor of San Francisco has been encouraging tech companies to bring people back, and tech companies are like, we will bring people back when they want to come back. But at any rate, the city has been losing a ton of money because of whatever dynamic they have going on there. So, but as a tech company, we don't. We're getting a lot of savings in that case. So, but it's definitely for large portfolio companies when you think about from an accounting standpoint, that does play into the real estate strategy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm in Washington D.C. and we're hearing the same thing from the mayor of the city. Right, come back, come back. Now, a lot of it's some economic incentives, right? If we're not working out of the city, we're not using restaurants, we're not hitting the
Yeah,
stores on the way
absolutely.
home, or whatever. Right? There's a lot of economic, but I've never considered how companies may pay for that space in terms of taxes, how that may fit. And I have no idea from a DC perspective how that's done, but I could see there's definitely some incentives to, there's pros and cons, right? More cars clog the roads, and so people don't really get a lot. They don't stop for the stores if they've got a rush in traffic. So there's probably this balancing act that cities have to play when they do city planning. How does this workplace strategy work now in the new post-COVID world? Now that we are not always going to the office, is it still, how does that play for you in terms of it's not always about the physical space anymore?
No, and I think, so much of what I did from a workplace strategist was, that at that point, I would say 50% of what I did was about the building and the office itself. Even pre-pandemic, I was very much focused on operations, process, and policies, right? And how you utilize the space you have, I think, and in that aspect. But my job at Slack has shifted, as you can imagine, over time. So I was brought in to bring some rigor to our building and design processes. So you will find that this is true of not only Slack, but actually a lot of other startups. When I was an outside consultant working, is the person running and designing the offices is often the first office manager that that company or organization has ever had, and they assisted the office in the first move, and then they got really interested in working with architects and being in that realm, without necessarily having an architecture background, which is, like I said, it doesn't happen. It doesn't just happen at Slack. It happens at a lot of places. I feel like it's a natural trajectory for some people. But then you do, we were telling architects what we needed in terms of space, just high numerical values. Like we need three small, like this many desks because we got it from our headcount numbers. And because of that many desks, we need X number of small conference rooms, X number of medium-sized conference rooms, X number of large-sized conference rooms. That's fine up to a certain point. But then when you look at like a portfolio of spaces and you realize that even the size of your small conference rooms are varying because you didn't tell the architect the size you need your small conference room to be, there becomes a point where you need to create a little bit more rigor around the design process, and also just kind of begin. Here it's back to talking to the stakeholders, talking to the business about what they need to be successful. So, if there's a conference room crunch, do we have too many large conference rooms with one person sitting in them? Do we need more? Like, how do we need more? Is it really small conference rooms do we need? Like, or are we working with pizza teams, where pizza sized teams, or it's like we really need to expand the middle? So that was where I was pre-pandemic in terms of how do we create more structure around our design and build processes of our offices. And then post-pandemic, it's really been leaning more heavily on operations, process, and policies, and saying, what is the office? When do you come into the office? How does operations change when you come into the office? And then how do we assist our employees in new ways of working? So an example that I always give, which tends to make people cringe a little bit, is my most productive hours as the pandemic has worn on starts at 9 p.m. in the evening after the house goes to bed, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have an office with a door. Literally doing this podcast and the floor of the bedroom because it offers like the most acoustic, it's the best acoustical space. And it's a room with a door. So so if the future of work is really about giving your employees the greatest amount of flexibility, then how do you work asynchronously better in ways that we haven't before? And what does that look like? And how do we use our tool being Slack to do that. What a lot of people don't realize about Slack is pre-pandemic, we were like every other company, even with our tool. Everyone was assigned a desk. We were 3% remote. So I feel like we are on the same trajectory of everyone else, except we just have this really kind of fun tool we get to play with along the way to help support how we decide how we want to be digital first in the future going forward.
That's very interesting. And then there also opens up the avenue of, like, I know this is a topic of conversation where I work, things that we can do to help your work environment at home be more conducive to productivity, be it a stipend of some sort so you can get some better equipment, or considerations for health, like get a gym membership, right? You used to go to the building and we had a free gym, but now you don't have the access to that gym anymore. So can we give you some incentives to do that in your local community, kind of thing? So it's very interesting.
Yeah. So it's really looking at the entire employee experience and how do we support our employees in this new working environment better. So, and it's not, I mean, it's funny because people are like, oh, that people aren't showing up in the office. That means we're going to be saving a ton of money. I think what it really is truly is a shift of resources, right, to supporting this bigger environment that allows people to work more flexibly. I'm sure there are companies that are saving money, but I don't feel like that's necessarily the answer.
Well, it depends, right? If they had a long-term lease, or if they sold off their building or subleased their building, maybe they could save some money. I know my sister works for a law firm, and they did something like that where they subleased the space and just said, never come in. We're permanently no longer there, and when our lease is up, we're going to let it expire.
Yeah, I guess the argument, back to your gym comment though, is that you're actually taking that money and spending it on some other aspect of the employee experience. So I think holistically, if you're looking at your bottom line, you're not necessarily saving money, even though you're using less space.
That's true. So what prompted you to found the practice of architecture?
Yeah, so the practice of architecture goes back to the statement I made earlier about architects being horrible business people. And the majority of firms in the US are actually small to medium sized businesses. So I would say 10 or 12 people or less. And we are very myopic. We navel gaze a lot, and we tend to learn about how to run our own firm from those who taught us how to be in a firm. So I was learning all of these things in business school about, I don't know, even marketing, business development, different types of business strategy. And I was just like, this is what we should be learning about in architecture. So it's really, how do you take lessons learned from outside of the profession and reapply them in a productive way back into practice that will hopefully sustain the profession in the long term. I feel like the other thing architects tend to do a lot for some reason is we like to complain about everyone who has come in and taken our services away from us. So the construction administrators, the project managers, and that was all good in intention. But then I went to business school and I said, but why aren't we asking ourselves, what can we do to, one, get that back, or two, have a bigger share in the market? Because if all we're doing is complaining about everything going away, then at some point the industry and the profession is going to go away. So that's ultimately what practice of architecture is. Practice Disrupted as a podcast has become an extension of that, in a way to reach a broader audience. And thankfully, it's actually kind of serves that purpose. Janine and my co-host and I have found out we're not alone in the world in this way of thinking. And especially I feel like the younger generation. So I'm Gen X, she's a millennial, but definitely millennials and Z, I think they're asking a lot more in the best way possible of their employees, both to benefit the broader community, but also benefit their own kind of mental health and well-being. So I feel like we're on this precipice between the pandemic, VCs investing a lot in the AEC space, so architecture, engineering, and construction space, the younger generation pushing us to do more, that we really need to evolve as a profession to remain relevant.
Wow. So as you've gone through your career and you've experienced a lot of interesting things, what's something that you've witnessed that you just wish you could have changed? Like you could get people to understand there might be a different or better way to do something, and maybe the thing you'd like to have changed is really really large, too big, maybe, and maybe we're just asking you to call our attention to something that we should consider changing. What might that be for you?
So two things. I would say, architecture is this really interesting space. Like I think everybody at one point, like they're like, oh, I wanted to be an architect, but I was bad at math. And we have structural engineers for that. You actually don't need to be good at math to be an architect. But the misnomers, I think people don't understand the value that architects bring to kind of the decision making process, and we're seen as this group of people that serve kind of a certain clientele who can afford us. But I think there's a lot of architects that are doing amazing work in affordable multifamily housing. That's worth kind of checking out and understanding what architects are trying to do to improve the communities that they live in. So I don't know. So I mean, more broadly, and something I can't solve on my own in a really meaningful way, maybe is just kind of having the world understand the value that architects deliver. And then I think, something that I can affect and something that we're looking at doing more at Slack, and even as I look at what we're developing out of practice of architecture, is really how do you support the middle managers? And I feel like there, Jeremy, you and I were talking before we hit record, like there's a lot of support for the executive suite, and there's a lot of support for people that are just trying to find their footing, after they graduate their college or you come from college or university. There's very little support, but I feel like there's the most amount of demand for those middle managers. These are the people that are doing the work, right? That are in the trenches, that need to meet the KPIs that are being set by the executives, but are also the ones that all of a sudden need to know how to manage distributed teams, especially as we're in this state of the pandemic and people are instituting these return to office policies, and no one's really like helping the middle managers right now. And I feel like we actually have surveys, thefutureforum.com, which Slack is a part of, has surveys showing that like nearly 50% of middle managers will tell you outright that they're burnt out right now, which is the highest level of the largest percentage even since the start of the pandemic. So support for middle managers.
Wow. So what's coming up for you in the near future? I know you're doing the podcast and you have your community. What's something you might highlight that's coming up, so next time somebody runs into you, they can ask how that went?
So many things. I always feel like I have so many forks in the fire. So there's a lot of things going on. I think if architects find your way to the podcast, I have a long laundry list of things that I want to do to increase. We have a very small community. It's called the Practice of Architecture Community, and then there's a Practice of Architecture Lab within the community. So my hope would be that has grown in size kind of the next time you see me, because that's the best way that I feel that I can be helping more people that in small and medium-sized firms with their career and figuring out the business, that their own business that they're delivering to their clients.
Wow. Well, Evelyn, I want to thank you so much. You've educated me a lot on building architecture. But architecture is architecture, right? It's all about structure and processes, and whether it's physical or whether it's digital. So just thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jeremy. I really appreciated this opportunity.